So I'm here to talk to you about fake news, why people believe what they believe, and what we can do as technologists. I'm just gonna grab the mic. I'm sorry. Um, all right. So I've been looking into fake news since 2016, and you might be wondering why 2016? And I feel like 2016 was a big turning point for us, and it was a big turning point for me because obviously I knew that there were fake news out there, but I didn't really think that people believed them. And then this happened. So how many of you have heard of the Pizzagate story, fake news story? So based on a data dump of some emails, some people read through them and made this like hypothesis that there was a child smuggling ring being run out of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. Absolutely no basis in reality. But people really believed it. I mean, to the point where when I saw this photo of the two parents with their kids who are wearing a shirt that says "I believe in Pizzagate," like it's just like I don't know how we got there. And what I also think it's interesting is that there was a person, and this again was what really got me interested in trying to understand why someone would believe this. There was a person who showed up at the alleged pizza place with a gun because he was dissatisfied with all of the debunking that you could have found online about this issue. He was dissatisfied and he wanted to find things out for himself. So he shows up to this pizza parlor with a gun to try to figure out where are all the kids. Obviously he didn't find anything because the story was fake. But this really shows that there can be very real consequences because of fake news stories. And also, there was a bit of a local tie-in. I'm from Austin, Texas, which is quite quite far away from Washington, D.C. And then there's this little pizza parlor called Eastside Pies, which is about the size of maybe smaller than this stage. But somehow people also thought that there was that this was tied to that same ring. And I think it was something to do with the logo because the logo is a triangle. So then the thought behind it was that the triangle was the sign of the Illuminati. I'm not kidding you. So I was like, well, great, I can't go get Eastside Pies now for fear of my life. Luckily, nothing happened, but it really got me to start thinking, why do people believe fake news? And one of the first things that I did was to reach out to a friend of mine. His name's Travis Weisgood, so he gets a lot of credit for some of the stuff that I started reading and looking into. I reached out to him because he had worked for a lot of publishing and media companies on the tech side, so I felt like he had a unique understanding of the issue and what we could possibly do about it. And he essentially told me, like, Cecy, it's not a tech issue. We're wired to believe this. And I was like, what? And he pointed me in the direction of some books, and I started reading. So this is kind of where I came across a lot of this idea of why we're wired to believe fake news. So this is the psychology behind fake news. And I'm going to touch on a couple of things. I'm going to touch on how beliefs are formed, and then also how we experience knowledge and how these two things play into why people do end up believing fake news. So let's start with how beliefs are formed. So this all I got from Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a good book. And at the end, I'll tweet out my notes so that if you want to go and check out these books, you can. So there was a study that people did in which they described this person named Steve to people, and they said, Steve is a very shy and withdrawn person. He's helpful, but shows little interest in people. He's meek and tidy with a passion for structure. Is Steve a farmer or a librarian? And most people in the study zeroed in on meek and tidy, and as a gut reaction, they said, he's a librarian. But from this study, what people sort of failed to realize is that there's actually, for every one librarian, there's 20 farmers. So it is actually more likely that Steve would be a farmer than a librarian. But again, people zeroed in on that like sort of like gut instinct. Meek and tidy, typically that describes a librarian, so Steve is a librarian. They didn't really take the time to maybe think through that question. And we'll come back to that, about how we sometimes tend to answer more difficult questions with an easier question. So we have two ways of thinking. System one, which is where the fast thinking comes from the book title. System one is fast. It's automatic, it's intuitive. That's where your gut reactions come from. That's where things that you don't have to think about come from. And then we have system two, which is analytical, and this is where the slow comes from the thinking fast and slow. So when we use our analytical mind, we actually have to spend like brain power thinking about things. So beliefs actually are formed in our system two mind. We have to think about it. But how we act on those beliefs comes from that instinctual part of the brain. So again, that's when people were asked, what do you think Steve is? People answered more from that gut feeling rather than actually thinking through the problem. So when you think about fake news and see fake news through that lens, one thing that you'll notice, and actually these are two fake news sites run by the same person. So if you look at both headlines, what do they both have in common? They're both appealing to feeling. White House finally gives Kellyanne Conway the boot. Are you glad? White House just gave Conway the boot. Prepare to be infuriated. They're appealing to our emotions. And that's why fake news tend to fare quite well when people are scrolling through things. It gets to that gut feeling and it makes you want to act on it. So if you think about it, this is really nothing more than yellow journalism, which has been around for over a century. And it's been around because it works, because it appeals to that part of our brain. So yeah, sensationalistic headlines, they work because they appeal to our feelings. And again, this is kind of tried and true. So where do feelings fit with our beliefs and knowledge? So typically I try to separate feelings and knowledge, right? Those two things are different. But actually, like I said earlier, it turns out that sometimes they're a little bit more sort of like intricated. So when faced with a difficult question, we answer an easier one instead. Again, this is from Thinking Fast and Slow. So here's an example. This is how we answer questions with feelings. How should financial advisors who prey on the elderly be punished? What we answer would be something more like, how much anger do I feel when I think of financial predators? So when we're presented with a harder question, we try to reply by answering an easier question. So we can often confuse feelings for knowledge. So I want to talk about how, not just about knowledge, but about how we experience knowledge. So, and I'm getting this from The Knowledge Illusion, which is also a great book. So there was an exercise, and some of this became a meme. If you've seen really bad drawings of bikes, it came from this study. So they asked people, hey, how well do you know bikes? And then people said like, oh yeah, I ride a bike. I know bikes really well. Okay, draw a bike. And then they failed miserably. So then afterwards they said, okay, how well do you know bikes? And most of the time, people would rank their knowledge lower. So what happened here? People experienced their lack of knowledge, and then they adjusted how they felt about knowing that or not knowing. So knowledge is shallow by design, because if we were aware of how much we don't know, our brains would literally not function. So the way that the authors of The Knowledge Illusion explain this is by saying, if we had to know all of the intricacies about metallurgy, the Bronze Age wouldn't have amounted to much. So that's why our brain tries to give us this false sense of confidence about our own knowledge. Because if we were actively aware of how much we don't know, we literally couldn't even. So this is where that term, the knowledge illusion, comes from. So it's not just that we are sort of fooled into this thinking that we know more than we actually do, but also strong feelings about things don't actually come from deep understanding, and they deepen as people believe things together. So I really think it's interesting that this book also kind of confirms some of the things that Thinking Fast and Slow talks about, which is how often we respond with our feelings because it's the intuitive thing to do. So that's why strong feelings about issues don't emerge from deep understanding. So when we experience things as a group, we end up, it's kind of like a house of mirrors. Again, you're probably starting to think about Facebook or Twitter. We surround ourselves with people who share our beliefs, and we see ourselves reflected back in everybody, and that strengthens that belief. So when you think about that, and how we believe things together, and now we are believing things together believing things together has been made easier thanks to things like Facebook and Twitter. This is how we get to this idea or how fake news spread. So there was a great article in The Atlantic about fake news. It was an article, I believe, that was citing an MIT study where they spent like years looking through Twitter data. And this is what they found. It seems to be pretty clear that false information outperforms true information, and that is not just because of bots. It might have something to do with human nature. So they essentially tracked a couple stories. They tracked more, but these are the ones that they talked about in the article. So then they had two stories. One is true, one is not. First story. Then presidential hopeful Donald Trump flies critically ill child Andrew, 10, from California to New York in his private jet for treatment. The second story. Obituary from Donald Trump's deceased cousin implores the public not to vote for the GOP presidential candidate. One is true, the other one is false. The true one is the positive one. The false one is the negative one. And the false one outperformed the true one by about a magnitude of 6. And if you really think about it, if we think about how we respond to things, how we tend to respond from a place of feeling, you can start to think like, okay, I guess that's why fake news stories tend to spread like wildfire, because those fake news stories, the ones that tend to really spread and be more popular, are ones that elicit a really strong emotional response from us. This also gives way to the hate click, which is I think most people call these hot takes, but of all places, Screen Crush wrote a really great article on why we need to stop sharing those hot takes and the hate click, because what people are doing is that we're moving now beyond this idea of like, I'm just going to write really infuriating headlines so that I can get people to click on my content, and now people are actually writing things from a purposefully negative perspective to get people to hate click on something because they know they're going to share it, just from the idea of like, can you believe this? So we are giving way now to a brand new wave of content just based from that emotional reaction to get you to hate click on something. So can we disprove fake news? We've already talked about how when people experience their own lack of knowledge, they might rank their knowledge a little bit lower once they experience how much they don't know. So they tried to do, the same folks from The Knowledge Illusion talk about another study where instead of asking people to draw a bike, they asked people to explain policy. So then they said, okay, how much do you believe in whatever policy? Very strongly for it. Okay, explain to us how this policy works and how it would affect others. And then they also asked them to like step by step tell us exactly how it works and how it's going to affect other people. And then when people did that exercise, they realized they didn't really know much about how the policy worked. So then at the end of the exercise, they asked people again, how much do you think you know about this policy? And also, where do you rank yourself? And most people, again, would rank their knowledge lower, and most people moved more to a moderate position on the policy. So you might think, great, that shows change, right? Let's do that. And the thing is that after doing that exercise, people actually didn't really change their minds completely, because it turns out people don't like to feel dumb. So when doing this exercise, when people were asked to like explain their position and really think about their policies, they realized, oh, well, I guess I don't really know as much as I thought, and the experience ended up being negative. So therefore, they might have maybe come around just a little, but they didn't really have like a 180. So it really is a bit of a tricky situation. I also thought this was really interesting. This was an article published by The Guardian about a year ago where they switched people and they give people sort of like the opposite Facebook feed. So they gave people who identified as liberal, they gave them a conservative Facebook feed, and then vice versa. And then at the end of this study, I think they said something like they spent a month on a different feed. At the end of the study, you would think that maybe most people would like gain like a different understanding. But at the end of the study, the participants ended up feeling like a little bit of confirmation bias. They felt like being on the other side just confirmed their already existing beliefs. And I think that this might have been a little bit to do with that idea of like people don't like feeling dumb, people don't like feeling kind of maybe even that they don't belong. And a lot of the times when people have these ideas, it ties to that sense of belonging. So it really is a really fine line to balance. So to sort of wrap things up from the knowledge illusion, they talk about how a good leader must be able to help people realize their ignorance without making them feel stupid. And I feel like that's at the crux of how we get to address things like fake news, because we need to do it with empathy. We need to do it in a way that is not going to make people feel dumb because they believed in a fake news story. We need to do it in a way, again, that's not going to make them feel stupid, because that's actually going to not be very productive. So this is where we come in. Ooh, okay, so there's a thing called deep fakes, and some of you might have heard about them. How many of you listen to Radiolab? Woohoo! How many of you have seen this website, thefutureoffakenews.com? So I would definitely recommend you check that out. In this website, you can see an example of what a deep fake is. It is essentially a video that looks like the real thing. It looks like a person who is talking and saying things, and it looks like this person is saying those things, but it's nothing more than just video manipulation and voiceover, and it looks very real. So when they talk to the people that make this technology, people say like, well, we think that people are smart enough that they would be able to figure out that it's fake. But it turns out that that's not true. But then also, okay, so as technologists, how can we prove that videos are fake? We're gonna have a harder time trying to prove this, right? So I thought this was really interesting. I was sort of going through the Strange Loop hashtag. Strange Loop, I think, happened last week, and there's always some really interesting talks. And this slide that someone tweeted really caught my eye was from a talk about AI called AI Weirdness by Janelle Shane, and she has some really awesome data about AI. And in it, you can see the original image. It says 89% AI deemed it to be a lifeboat, and 0% a Scotch Terrier. When adding noise, and you can see this is what the noise that they added, it looks just like a little square. When they added noise, now AI deemed this to be a 0.03 likelihood that this was a lifeboat, and a 99.77% chance this is a Scotch Terrier. So as you can see, if we are relying on technology to help us figure out if something is fake or not, I think that people are going to have a harder time trying to figure that out as well. So we can't just leave this to the bots. Again, I think it was a couple of years ago when Facebook tried to do away with all human editors for their trending topics, and it all just kind of went to hell by just doing an algorithm do this. So we know that we can't just rely on AI and bots to do this. It's going to have to be a combination of two things. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that often we see companies not really taking ownership or responsibility about the things that they build. So there was a really great article on Vanity Fair about Twitter. And essentially, they asked, hey, Twitter, how come you're so bad at moderation? And then Twitter said, oh, well, we just couldn't build good moderation tools because we were on a really old version of Ruby on Rails. Yeah. So I really feel, and I got this from a blog post from Jessica Powell. She just recently wrote about why she left tech to go write books. And I thought this was spot on. You can't tell your advertisers that you can target users down to the tiniest pixel, but then throw your hands up before the politicians and say your machines can't figure out if bad actors are using your platform. That doesn't go together. So I really feel like we're in a bit of a pickle where we can have this duality in our industry where, like, yeah, we can definitely track people and we down to the tiniest pixel, but then also, oh yeah, moderation tools, like, I don't know about that. Like, so I really feel like in the end, it's just gonna come to us and the decisions that we make on a day-to-day. But there are also some tools out there that can sort of help push the needle forward. And I just want to wrap up by talking about a couple of things that I think are positives that could potentially be a turning tide. So I'm a big fan of this Perspective API. It essentially is an API that does a little bit of analysis on comments. So if someone says something like, you're an idiot, it'll like get back to the person and give them real life feedback on what they're typing, saying, hey, you might want to reconsider saying that, or you might want to say this instead of that. So just try to get people to think through a little bit more about what they're talking about. And then also, the Knight Foundation, 1 million to 20 projects to fight fake news. And I feel like there's a lot more opportunities like this out there. I feel like the opportunity is definitely out there for us to build those tools that are really going to change the world and try to move the tide. So the opportunity is out there. We just need to go and build these things. And I think that it's going to have to come from a place of empathy, and it's going to have to come from a place of having talks like the one that we just had where we talk about ethics. It's going to come from having more discussions about psychology and how things work and why people believe the things that they believe. We're going to have to spend time as an industry thinking about these things that truly we haven't really been thinking or talking about. But the opportunity is here. This is truly a transformative moment in our industry, and we really need to be able to go out there and try to build those tools to try to make the world a better place. But also know that fake news is a developing story in and of itself. I've given a version of this talk, and every time, I've given about 4 versions of this talk, because every time that I talk about this, things change and more things come to light. So this is very much still a developing story, and I would ask any of you, if you're passionate about this topic, just keep your eyes open and keep thinking about ways that you can try to make a difference. Thank you.